Great. The session has started to be recorded. Over to you, Bob. Thanks.
That's great, Suzanne. Thanks so much for the introduction. And I'd like to just welcome everybody right off the top for tuning into the first of our series of webinars this week, in Academic Integrity Week. For those of you who haven't met me or don't know me, my name is Bob Mann. I'm the Manager of Discipline and Appeals for the Dalhousie Senate. I know that it sounds like a very important job title. I'm okay with you believing that it's very important, but I can also tell you that my job for the last 10 years has been supporting academic integrity officers, members of the Senate Discipline Committee, members of the Senate Appeals Committee, and individual faculty members, and even student advocates and students themselves in kind of making their way through our processes and our procedures. So 10 years is enough time to have seen a lot of cases and to have seen a lot of conflicts and seen a lot of things go well and some things not go so well. So I like to think I've sort of gained a fair bit of knowledge and can speak to a lot of different scenarios. But I want to make sure that you're aware that we also have with us today some of the decision makers that I support and some people who have been doing the job in different disciplines and for some time, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves. I'll start with Susan Holmes. Susan, would you introduce yourself to everyone?
Thanks, Bob. I'm Susan Holmes, a faculty member with the College of Continuing Education, and I've been a panel member on Senate discipline hearings for quite a number of years now. It's been a really wonderful experience to see some of the difficulties that students get themselves into, and I'm happy to be part of the panel today.
Thanks, Susan. Next, we have also on the Senate Discipline Committee, Robin Parker. Robin, if you'd say hi to everyone.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Robin Parker. I'm one of the librarians at the Kellogg Health Sciences Library and also a representative on the Senate Disciplinary Committee. And I have been on the committee since 2015, so I'm just completing, I guess, my 5th year. And like Susan said, it's been an eye-opening experience to see students from across disciplines and encounter the faculty and AIOs who interact with them and try to help them navigate their experience with academic integrity.
Thanks, Robin. Next, we have one of many academic integrity officers we have in the university. I only have 2 here helping me today, and I'll start with Justin Roberts.
Hi, I'm Justin Roberts. I'm the academic integrity officer for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I apologize today. My voice is a little hoarse. I had a bit of a throat injury, but it's fine. It's not COVID related, thankfully. But I'm happy to be here today.
Hopefully it's also not from yelling at people.
Definitely not from yelling at people, although occasionally that will happen during the middle of the year when large lecture classes start up. Hopefully they'll start up again soon.
That's encouraging. Thanks, Justin. And last but certainly not least, Khurram Aziz from the Faculty of Computer Science.
Thank you, Bob. Hello, everyone. I am Khurram Aziz from the Faculty of Computer Science. I've been an AIO for the last 2 or 3 years and done about 100 or so cases, roughly. So I'll be happy to answer any questions from the faculty members' perspective as well as an AIO perspective.
Thanks, Khurram. So I guess by way of sort of introduction to the session here, I'll give a bit of an overview of sort of how we're hoping to go about this. One of the, as I was saying to one of your panelists earlier, one of the advantages that I have in the job that I have is that I'm in attendance for almost over the last decade, almost every Senate Discipline Committee hearing, which is always just about academic integrity. Those include code offenses and things like that. But I've been able to see those scenarios and also laid eyes, at least, on the integrity officer cases that get settled at the faculty level. One of the things that I think it's important to reinforce for you right from the get-go is that these decisions that are made when it comes to what ought to be done about these cases, how they're handled, what factors to weigh. These are by and large your colleagues that are doing this. I want to state right off the top, and I've believed this from day one, that academic integrity is something that belongs to the academy, and you as a member of the academy and your colleagues who serve in decision-making capacities, you get to have open and ongoing conversations about how serious things are, how seriously they should be taken, what we should do about it. You will not always agree, as you will rarely agree on anything. But there's no reason that academic integrity should be any different. But it is an ongoing conversation, and we have those conversations within the context of cases and also outside of them. So I'll say that right off the top. One of the approaches that I felt very strongly about in talking to you, and an hour is not a long time to talk about this topic, I wanted to be very certain to focus on something specific enough that you could take something away on it. And what I really wanted to focus on was the experience of bringing an allegation forward, who you would be dealing with, what that experience would be like and what would happen. We didn't feel it would be a good use of time to spend an hour walking you through all of the rules and the different policies and all of the different steps. I don't think the retention value for that would be very high. I don't think it's very good for opening up conversation and asking questions about the specific things you're concerned about. Whereas most of the time I find the thing that really affects people are their expectations of what it will be like, what will happen. Are you as a faculty member going to be exposed to anything that maybe you're not aware of? Are you unwittingly exposing a student to some sort of harm or prejudice that you don't mean to, and that once you file that allegation, it's out of your hands and it will be a runaway train? I hear those concerns all the time. And so, I sort of wanted to make sure that we had a session that focused on those things a little bit. And gave you an opportunity to do some thinking about yourself and what maybe your expectations are. And when we get around to questions, you can ask some of those questions. And we've got integrity officers and discipline committee members who've actually worked on these cases who can answer your questions. And in a lot of cases, probably answer them better than I do. But again, by way of introduction, before we get into sort of the meat and potatoes of it, I'll say it's important to note that our system is one where cases are decided on their individual merits. We have a scale of responses when we believe that someone has committed an academic integrity violation in the university. But believe it or not, it's not actually a very wide spectrum. We're talking about penalties on assignments, papers, exams, penalties that apply to course grades, and then you get notations on transcripts, and then you get up into suspensions or expulsions, and then which are rare. And then on top of it, we have a lot of different remedial measures we put in place for people who are struggling with writing. The Library Writing Center is one resource we turn to, study skills resources, all sorts of different things like that. And we try to tailor things to the individual student so that we can put them in the best position of not committing an offense again if we can. And on that note, I would also add that it's important to say that not all cases we deal with are necessarily matters of integrity, so to speak. Cases exist on a spectrum. A lot of times we deal with cases that I think can be more properly characterized as being the result of sloppiness or negligence, or students still trying to situate themselves to the level of academic work and research that they're doing. And sometimes students will find themselves accidentally in a situation where it's an integrity violation, and those cases can sometimes be very difficult to figure out what the right thing to do for people is. The last thing I will say before we sort of get into the meat of it, and I really do believe this is an important piece, and I reinforce this with everybody. A policy that belongs to an institution can really only prepare a participant for so much. Whether in our system here, this is a judicial process. Someone is being accused, so to speak, of having something. You believe that a student in your course has plagiarized or worked with another student when they shouldn't have, or that they've done something below board during the writing of an exam, any number of things. That process of working that through can sometimes be very adversarial. and people, and by people I mean students and faculty alike, and sometimes even their supports, can easily find themselves defensive. It is an emotional and a very supercharged, sometimes, kind of exercise. And what I would say is that personalities play a huge role in the experience of a case, sometimes even more so than the policy or the rules itself. And I think what I'd like to say off the top is that professionalism, compassion, efforts to keep things from getting personal, all of those things go a long way in keeping cases constructive, educational, and personally over 10 years, I've seen far better outcomes for students and for everyone involved when people can kind of stay focused on what we're actually trying to achieve. So that's what I would say by way of kind of opening. And then we're going to say a few things here about the rules, but I don't want to say a whole lot before we get into the two main involvements that you will have as someone who's filing an allegation. First of all, we have two main policies, really. Well, three, I suppose. The first one is the listing of academic offenses, which you will find in the Dalhousie calendar under academic dishonesty. If any of you have never looked at it before, you might be surprised to see that it's not actually very long. It speaks to plagiarism. It speaks to collaboration, where collaboration is unauthorized. It speaks to falsification of data. And then there's a sort of other category, anything, any behavior that's designed to gain an unearned advantage by a student. And over the years, we've had a number of odd situations that fall under that heading. But that's the sort of, I suppose, criminal code, for lack of a better expression, that we have. That's where you go to see if something that you have fits within an academic integrity violation. But a lot of times we work that out through discussion, and that listing of rules don't really come into play all that much. What you sort of experience more acutely are these rules that we see. First, the faculty discipline procedures, which are in their 11th year or 12th year of existence here at Dalhousie, and that's a process whereby integrity officers within the faculties are given the authority to meet with students and resolve allegations. So, you know, just for example, on this webinar, you have Justin Roberts, you have Khurram Aziz. Within their faculty, they would be the ones who would look at the allegation. They would be the ones who would decide if there's enough evidence, and we'll get into this a bit more later. And they would be the ones maybe to have a conversation with you about anything they need to understand, and then the student would get brought in, and a meeting would be convened to talk about the allegation, hear what the student has to say. That's done up anywhere between 400 and 500 times a year at Dalhousie, and those aren't, you know, not specific statistics, but that's roughly where they land. And so a lot of cases get resolved that way. Any cases that can't be resolved that way, either the student's not willing to resolve it, or if the student has prior offenses, or if the student, or if it's a very, very serious matter, those are referred to the Senate Discipline Committee. And the Senate Discipline Committee has its own rules, and that Discipline Committee consists of, each panel consists of 3 faculty members and 2 students, and we don't settle cases there. These are cases where the panel hears the evidence, hears the defense, has a conversation, asks questions, and then afterwards imposes a binding decision on the student with whatever their findings are and whatever their penalties or remedies for the case may be. That's a very, very brief and 30,000-foot view of the rules themselves, and obviously there are some a lot of, you know, bells and whistles, so to speak, or there are some details and some finer things that could be said about that process. Those are probably not of a lot of value to you right now, as typically people learn and discover and understand these rules as they are needing to in the middle of a case, and the integrity officers, with my support, are sort of the keepers of the keys on those rules and making sure that they're followed. Probably the only rule for you, though, that I will say right off the top that I would like you to be aware of is this sort of technical time limitation that you have to file. If you look at the rules, and I'll just go back one slide very quickly. The faculty discipline procedures say that an instructor is required to bring to the integrity officer's attention their suspicion of a violation in 10 calendar days of discovering it. Sometimes that's not practical or feasible, and the integrity officer has the discretion to say, okay, well, it's been a couple of weeks, or you were away, or maybe there's some reasons why you weren't able to fully bring it forward, you weren't sure, and so they have the discretion to waive that. But it's important for you to remember that the reason why that rule exists is so that a student has a fair and full opportunity to respond to it. And if the allegation is too old or stale, and someone is not able to kind of recall certain things that may be held against them, then they could be prejudiced as a result of that delay. So there's a little bit of a fire lit underneath you to move this thing along with some dispatch, and any of you who've been involved with it know that these things can be turned around fairly quickly. And when the discipline committee, when the faculty discipline procedure rules were created, it was the student union participants involved who asked for short timelines, for including timelines that applied to students turning around responses or accepting or rejecting outcomes, because they wanted as much as possible to avoid these cases stretching on, being delayed, not being resolved in a timely way. And so there are some short timelines in there, but we have a lot of flexibility. That's what I would say right off the top. I want to throw it out to my participants now, though, to see if they need to add to what I've already kind of laid out. Khurram, I see you have your hand raised. You can go ahead.
Thank you, Bob. That's very well summarized. I'd just like to add from a faculty member's point of view that if you suspect something has occurred, an academic integrity violation has occurred, just report it. You do not have to be the decision maker in this case. If it is nothing, the AIO will just inform you that there is no merit, and the student most often does not even have to know about this. In some other cases, especially the borderline cases, there might be something worth discussing with the student. So we can call up a meeting. After the meeting, it may be that the student was not in violation, but the discussion may be beneficial for the student to avoid crossing the borderline into the violation territory. So from a faculty member's point of view, whenever you suspect something, just report it.
That's great, Khurram. Thank you for that. Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I want to reiterate that the initial meeting with the student doesn't necessarily have to find them guilty. It doesn't have to appear on their record. It can just be a chance to connect with the student, and we don't often get that chance. And so if a professor is concerned or a faculty member is concerned the student has come even close to a transgression, this is a moment in time, especially with a first or second year student, to sit down with them one-on-one and have them really listen and understand what the problem is. And simply writing in a paper or sending an email or making a comment to a student in class doesn't have as much of an impact as sitting down with them one-on-one with an academic integrity officer or professor. So to a certain extent, what you're doing is you're saving the student from future problems, since the penalties tend to escalate with, at least my sense, you can speak to this, Bob, but they tend to escalate from the first to the second to the third, the fourth year, and so on. More senior students are going to have more severe penalties. So it really is incumbent upon us as faculty members to try to intervene, especially at the early stages when a student's committed an offense.
Thank you for that, Justin. Yeah, that's well put. Khurram, I agree with all of those points. I've certainly seen those things, that there's no harm in reporting, and at the very least, there's no harm in having a conversation with your integrity officer, who, again, I'll reiterate this, that it will be one of your colleagues. It will be someone that you work with, and it will be someone that can have open and full and frank discussions with you about whether what is or isn't, whether there are any issues with it, whether you need to provide more. And those can be fairly low stakes conversations. You don't have to worry necessarily about initiating something and losing full control of it by having those conversations. We encourage that, and we'd like to see that happen. That segues very nicely, frankly, into this first sort of bit that we wanted to speak to, which is this question that I'm sure sort of sits in the minds of people sometimes when they discover things, which is, should I report this? I won't say a whole lot about somebody who maybe thinks to themselves, this will be a weight on my time, or this will be too much work, or you know, this will be something that will be kind of the butt, so to speak, and I don't really want to be bothered doing this. I don't cast any aspersions on that sort of attitude, because I understand it as a very human thing. I think that there are lots of times where people just say, I just don't want to be involved in this. You're making an active choice, and that's understandable. There's not a lot that can be done about that. However, I felt it was important to make some points here in support of at least going and having a conversation with your integrity officer up to the point of reporting. The policy says, yes, you are supposed to report. In fact, the faculty discipline procedures say right at the top that, and this is skipping to my second sub-bullet here, any penalty, so to speak, that you directly give to a student for what you believe is an academic integrity violation is considered null and void. And if it's reported by the student or discovered, that grade that you've given, whether it's an F, whether it's a reduction of a grade, whatever, can be just summarily overturned. And in order to be applied, or what is that will get applied, is required to go through the integrity officer process. That was something that was called for when the discipline procedures were created, to avoid wide varieties of responses and very unfair and unjust responses between faculty members, even of the same department or faculty, and try to bring consistency to things and make sure that students are all treated the same way, at least in terms of the process that they're given. Those are all good things, and everyone out there, I would hope, should be concerned that they might have the right attitude when it comes to academic integrity, but maybe other faculty members don't. And if everyone were left to their own devices, we'd have a crazy hodgepodge of responses to similar offenses and similar issues. And some of them may be very unfair. Students are actually quite slow to come forward and say, I think I was issued a grade that what didn't go through a proper process. Why? Because they're not guaranteed they'll get a better outcome if they go through the proper process. And so a lot of them, my understanding through student advocates, is they stay kind of quiet about that. And that's a bit of an unfair situation to be put in. One of the benefits you have as a faculty member at Dalhousie is that the integrity officer is the person who has the authority to determine whether you have a case, whether there's enough evidence. They are the ones who are accountable for recommending a finding and a penalty to a student. You are not responsible for that. You do not have to assume the responsibility for it. You don't have to weigh those things. You get to hand it over to somebody else. And there are other universities that I've spoken to over the years who are looking at our process and are interested in it, and a couple who even have already, because they like this idea that an individual faculty member does feel the weight of that, or the responsibility of that. They have a colleague that will do it. So that's one advantage. That's one good reason for you to report. I'll skip down to the last one, though, because I think the second one maybe is the most important. Integrity officers and the discipline committee, they have a fair bit of latitude and discretion to avoid disproportionate outcomes for students. So if you're worried that reporting will have, you know, a really terrible impact to a student that you don't think is fair or isn't intended, you have an opportunity to say that in the process. Students have an opportunity to raise those issues if you haven't thought of them, or if no one else might think of them. And the integrity officers and the discipline committee have the freedom to consider those things and weigh those things. A student with one penalty might suffer consequences that are unfair relative to another one with the same penalty. We don't have to use our imaginations a whole lot in order to understand that and how that works. And I think any of you as professionals, I would hope, would if you were accused of something, let's say in the conduct of your employment or in some other context, you would hope that whoever it is making a decision about what should happen with you would be open to hearing you say, here's my situation, here are my circumstances, here's what will happen if this happens to me, and that they take that seriously and they will weigh it. I think that's fair, and I think that's just, and our system allows for that. The last thing I will say before we move into the AIO piece is that I really do believe that reporting in whatever capacity, it really does serve the entire academic community. If you don't report, if you have a concern about a student and you don't report it, that student is then going to go on and take another course. They may be taking other courses in the moment. Not having something brought to their attention may lead them to believe that what they're doing is fine. They may get pretty far if there are enough faculty members who take that view and don't report, and then suddenly you have a student in their third year or their fourth year who finally ends up in that class with a professor who is comfortable and has a record of reporting, and suddenly they're being accused of something they've been doing for a few years. We've seen that. We've watched that happen. And it's very unfortunate when that happens, because oftentimes when you've got a student in third or fourth year, the expectations on them are higher. So that's one reason why, kind of, even if it's a small thing, why reporting it and saying I have a concern here can benefit. It benefits your colleagues down the road. It benefits the students in the moment, and I think it better situates them it better positions them to make good decisions when they do come up against some challenging moments where they might be tempted to make a bad decision. Before moving to our next slide, I see Susan has a comment she wants to make. Susan, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to comment on that, Bob, and say that as a panel member, some of our most challenging deliberations are when a student is almost ready to graduate and they are before the discipline panel, and they make the case that what they have been doing must have been right because they have never been caught before, or it's never been a problem before. So I think it helps all concerned for things to be reported and looked into early so that the students can have their behavior corrected. And further, I'd like to say that I think all of us, including employers, want to feel confident that a graduate of Dalhousie knows how to behave following academic honesty processes. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Susan. Yeah, that reinforces that point lightly or nicely. And again, it is good, and you will hear a little bit more of this. You'll hear a little bit more about situations that make the decision making difficult, and factors that weigh very heavily on discipline committee panels and the integrity officers. And some of those are things that you can help with, and hopefully we'll be able to point those out. So very quickly, just talking about the integrity officer level, and again, I invite Justin or Khurram to kind of weigh in on any of the points here, but I won't linger too much on them. I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end if anyone has any. But at the integrity officer level, we talked about how you can simply go to your integrity officer and say, I have a concern. You will be directed to a form that you can fill out, which is not required, but the information is required. And some of the things you're required to provide are obvious. What's the course number? What's the, what is the student's name and banner number, to make sure that we send an allegation to the right person? What are we talking about here? The form will direct you to those types of things. And one of the things the form will direct you to do is to provide an explanation of what it is that your concern is and what you're bringing forward. And just jumping ahead a little bit to the discipline committee, but I think this also speaks to the integrity officer level. The more clear and sort of succinct you can be about what it is that you are suspecting, the easier it will be going forward for everyone, including easier for the student to clearly respond to it. We have had instances of allegations that are not 100% clear, and someone isn't really fully sure what it is they're being accused of, and sometimes we have misunderstanding. The clearer it can be, the better, and the AIO can help you with that. And then obviously here, the first point we have, there are some other things that you will be asked to provide. Obviously, if it's an exam, you provide the exam. That includes a situation where a student is accused of, let's say, cheating on an exam in an in-person seated exam. Even if your evidence are things that you saw, things that you observed, or that your invigilator or your TAs observed or saw, you still provide the exam. If it's about an assignment, you provide that assignment. You provide the essay that the student wrote. That is pretty much a given in every single case. You will be asked to hand over a copy of that. Also, any evidence that you have. Do you have a paper that you believe has been plagiarized from sources? What are those sources? Do you have an Erkin report? Do you have printouts from a Google search? Do you have actual articles that were plagiarized? The decision maker will want to see those, and the student has a right to see what's being relied upon. The syllabus for your course is important. That's an easy one. And then, as I said, a written submission, just sort of summarizing what it is that you're suspecting and any other details that you believe are important. Those are going to be different for every case, and your integrity officer can provide you with some support. And if the integrity officer is not sure, I provide support in terms of what I believe ought to be provided and or not provided. For example, email correspondence that you've had with the student, oftentimes not relevant and not actually all that important for the allegation. Every now and again it is, but that's typically not something. You don't have to dump a bunch of emails on your integrity officer, but we will help you through that. Important to remember right off the top that your integrity officer's job is to be fair and objective. Their job is not to necessarily try to persecute a case on your behalf. Their job at first is to receive what you give them, probe for anything more that might be helpful, and then put that to the student and sit down and talk to them and try to figure out if there's anything about it that maybe should point to a less obvious outcome. But by and large, they're there to try to settle the case with the student. That meeting with the student might contain some conversation that you find challenging. There may be issues raised about your course, maybe even your teaching, maybe how you administer the course, maybe the student doesn't like you. There may be any number of things that happen, some of which may be a surprise to you, some of which aren't. But you don't have to engage with the student directly. You may, of course, but again, the AIO carries that responsibility on your behalf. If the student is raising things that are not relevant or that are maybe of a defensive nature but don't actually speak to the allegation, you do not have to meet them on that hill. That is not a requirement. You can simply let the AIO do their job in that regard. And I'll say a bit more about the meeting, but Justin or Khurram, anytime you want to jump in. Yeah, Khurram, go ahead.
Thanks, Bob. I'd just like to add that sometimes when you submit a Form A, anything that you can write in there, any sort of explanation, that helps us in the case. So even if there's something that you feel is not really important, but that you might have observed, can also help us in some way in determining whether determining actually what happened. So even if you don't think it's important, but you observed it, please write it, because when we see the student's point of view, the faculty member's point of view, and then we have a discussion with the student, many other things come up, and during that process, something that you might not have felt was important, but you had written about it, that helps us decide the case as well.
That's very helpful, Khurram. Thank you for that. Yeah, but anything you can do to be helpful to the process, it will point to a better outcome, including respecting the process. And that's the first point that I have here. It is to your benefit that the integrity officer is in charge, and you have the luxury, frankly, of letting the AIO be in charge of that meeting with the student. It doesn't have to be adversarial. And the more clear you can be and professional and compassionate, I find the better these things go. I won't repeat the point about not being on the defensive, but it's important to keep that in mind. Take stock of your personality. Some of us don't deal all that well with someone saying, well, yes, I'm accused of this, but what about them? And it's important to keep in mind that you don't have to go on the defensive because the matter is not actually about that. Justin, you had a point you wanted to make?
Yeah, I just want to chime in here, Bob, that when it comes to the faculty of arts social sciences, one of the things I try to make sure I do is I try to make sure that this is a continuing relationship between the professor and the students, because often the course is ongoing. And so I try to make sure I give the professor the last word. So even though we are taking over for a moment, even though we are intervening and we are um, following the procedure, at the end of every meeting, I will always say, I want to give the professor the last word. And so I want to make sure professors understand that they will remain part of the process, and that what we will do is we will do the more difficult parts of negotiating conflict and determining what penalties are and so on, and then turn it back over to the professor at the end. I think that's really important.
That is helpful, Justin, and reinforces that this is a process that was created with a view to making sure that faculty members can share their views and have their say about a case, but not carry the responsibility for the outcome necessarily, which I think has helped over the years by and large. I want to make sure we get to the discipline committee piece, so I will just say one last thing about this part. Final recommendation rests with the AIOs. They have that responsibility, but it's important that everyone understands that all the integrity officer does at this stage is recommend to the student the outcome. They recommend a finding and they recommend a penalty. Our rules say that a student can reject that. They can simply say no, and they can say no for whatever reason they choose. And if they do, that triggers a discipline committee hearing. One of the implications of a student being allowed to say no to the recommendation for whatever reason they choose is that there may be some reasons for them doing that that don't actually pertain to the finding or the penalty. They might say no because of how the meeting went. They might say no because they have issues about how they were treated or about how the process went. Anything you as a faculty member is reporting and attending that meeting can do to reinforce for the student that the goal is to be fair and to be objective. They may not like what they're hearing, but that you are there to hear them and to give them an opportunity to be heard, and that at first blush the goal is to be educational and give them an opportunity to move forward positively. Anything you can do in that vein will probably better the chances of the student accepting the outcome and moving forward. That's been my experience anyway, based on what I've seen. We've had a number of discipline committee hearings over the years that may have been unnecessary and that may have happened because the process became adversarial or became supercharged when it didn't have to. So that's just something for you to keep in mind going forward. I think it's good to have a good attitude going into these things, even though you may quite rightly have strong feelings about what a student has done and about their conduct in your class, all of which is fair. Moving ahead to the discipline committee hearing, we have roughly anywhere from 35 to 40 discipline committee hearings in any given year. Again, those are cases that cannot or should not be settled at the integrity officer level. Some of you on this webinar may have attended a discipline committee hearing. Some of you may never have. I don't like to use the word trial, but that certainly is what a lot of people involved feel like it is. The discipline committee panel is taken from a roster of faculty members and students, and they hear the evidence and they hear the defense from students if there is one, and then make a decision. As I said about the integrity officer piece, the chair of that hearing, that meeting, is in charge. They get to make decisions, and I would encourage everyone to respect that process as you would hope that anyone would respect a process you're responsible for, whether it's a class or whatever it is. That's very important. Your job is to be prepared to explain your allegation, and Susan earlier in the week raised a very good point, and it bears reinforcing. At your faculty level, you're going to be bringing your allegation to a colleague that is likely directly within your discipline or close. And there may be things about your allegation that you don't have to explain. There may be shorthand that you don't have to explain to that integrity officer. Maybe shorthand that doesn't have to be pointed out to the student either. They may readily understand what you're talking about. At the discipline committee level, you're likely going to have panel members who are more removed from it and may have to have aspects of the allegation sort of spelled out for them and have them walk through. And I'm going to suggest to you that that's actually quite a good exercise at being able to get very closely to the heart of the matter of the case that you have, and not be too tied up with a lot of jargon. And they can sometimes ask some questions that can be very revealing of what it is that we're trying to figure out that you may not even think to raise. Robin, you have a point to make on that?
Yes, I just to reemphasize that point that it really helps us to have that context and the understanding of what the expectations are within the discipline and within the faculty when we're making that decisions. But it also, as Bob pointed out, it does serve a purpose in the hearing. In some cases, we have hearings where the student hasn't responded to an AIO hearing, and that's part of the reason that the case has come forward to the SDC. And so it's making things very explicit helps to convey those expectations to the student as well in some cases where there hasn't been the opportunity to do that previously.
That's helpful, Robin, and also again, the more clear you can be in the actual crafting of your explanation of the allegation, the better. That always helps to kind of narrow things in. I see that Corey has a question. We'll come back to questions in just a few minutes as best that we can address them. Again, I want to point out that at the discipline committee level, the discipline committee is really only concerned with two things. One is, what is the evidence? What's the allegation? What's the evidence supporting it? And two, if the evidence is considered, if the case is considered proven, what's the penalty? There may be any number of other issues that get raised in the hearing or even in your mind that you believe are relevant, such as other conduct by the student in the course, interactions that you've had with them. Maybe there are things that they raise in their own defense that you feel are unreasonable or unfair or even can't possibly stand up to scrutiny, and you find yourself feeling very strongly about that. Some of those things are maybe issues, some of them may not. But the thing that I would say right off the top is the hearing's not an appeal of the AIO outcome. It's not an inquiry into teaching, evaluation methods of your course. It's also not into the strength of that student and their performance, even though questions may be asked about that because it matters for potential penalty. But it's important on your part to, as much as you possibly can, keep the case focused on the allegation and what kind of outcome we believe should happen. The student may try to take it in a number of different directions. They will be given a little bit of latitude sometimes in doing that because it is their defense. They are the ones for whom the stakes exist. I would encourage anyone who knows they might have those flowings within them to answer that call if someone raises issues that they feel strongly about, to resist taking that bait. And if you need a break, you have concerns, you have issues with those sort of things, we can accommodate those things in trying to deal with it. But we do try to keep things focused on the student as much as we can. Susan, you have a point. Go ahead.
I'd like to mention that a lot of students come to the SDC hearing with an advocate from Dalhousie Advocacy Services. And as a panel member, we really prefer when that happens because we know that someone has helped the student think about what their defenses may be. And when we compare that to the students who come on their own, ill-prepared, then the panel tries to ask questions so that the student gets a fair hearing and that we hear about situations going on that may be mitigating circumstances that help us make a final decision and educational opportunities or penalty or whatever that we feel is really fair compared to the treatment that other students get when they come with an advocate.
Thank you for that, Susan. And I will add that we are quite lucky as a university, although I'm sure there's some faculty members every now and again who feel differently depending on what kind of advocate they get. But ours are quite good. We're quite lucky to have a university that has a law school and has law students who have learned and are learning, and I provide the student advocates with a lot of support in terms of fine-tuning their advocacy. And it's important to remember that they're just learning too, and some of them are sort of sorting through their own approaches and strategies. And so having patience for students is very, very important. I want to come back to Corey's question, but I'll note, I see that Carla has made a note here. I was surprised to see a private lawyer attend along with the student rep. That's actually an important point to raise, and I want to say this. We are not, as an institution, prescriptive with students who are accused of misconduct of any kind with what kind of representation they are allowed or not allowed to bring with them. If a student wants to avail themselves of a student advocate, they may. If they want to bring a friend, a cousin, a relative, a parent, and every now and again one does, if they, for whatever reason, believe that the matter is important enough and serious enough, oftentimes they are wrong, but they believe it's serious enough that they should have a lawyer, we let them. And I do my best to encourage everyone, from faculty members right up to discipline committee chairs, to say, look, this is our process. It belongs to us. We know it well. We have it within ourselves to apply it fairly and justly and objectively. We don't have to be worried that a lawyer or a parent or a boyfriend or girlfriend or a partner or a friend or anything, someone who might have very strong feelings, not objective feelings about the student that we're accusing, we don't have to be afraid of them upending our process. We have it within ourselves to apply what we do and be fair and objective about it. And I feel very strongly about that we can achieve that. We don't have to change the way we do things because a student brings a different kind of advocate or because they bring a different kind of energy to the process. We can be stoic and professional and stay the course. And I believe everyone has that within them. But thank you for making that note. I'm glad I was reminded of that. And thank you for your note, Susan. Just moving to the outcome, because I want to make sure that we have a chance to address questions. Unlike the AIO process, where it's a recommendation, the Senate Discipline Committee issues a decision that is binding, and there are very limited ways that can be appealed. And really, I've only, maybe count on one hand a number of Discipline Committee decisions that have been altered over the last decade, and usually on very small technical issues. But by and large, the Discipline Committee is the place where a binding decision can be made about that student. Afterwards, you may be called upon to apply some part of that remedy. Maybe something needs to be regraded. Maybe a grade needs to be adjusted. There may be other remedies that need to be executed. If you have concerns or issues about those, you can raise them. We can have a conversation about them. But again, the Discipline Committee is the place where those things are heard and considered and weighed. We do very, very best to discourage, except in exceptional circumstances, giving a student an opportunity to redo something for credit. The circumstances under which that happens will be rare. Some of you may have had it. We try not to put you in a situation where you have to accept and reevaluate a piece of work from a student that you've gone through the integrity process with. Some of you may be quite comfortable with that. Some of you won't. We will do our best to gauge that. I will just say that by way of passing. But the most important thing I want to say is this last point before we move to questions, and that's that you as a faculty member at Dalhousie cannot appeal outcomes. There are some universities where you can, but I'll suggest to you that there's a good reason why you can't, and that's that you are a member of the institution. You are, to a certain extent, not using this word, but a sort of representative or an agent of that institution, and the outcome, whatever it is an outcome issued on behalf of the institution going through its process. You don't have to be accountable or responsible for it. You filed the allegation, you did your duty, and you provided your information. But you don't get to appeal the outcome. That said, there may occasionally be outcomes that you don't agree with. Maybe the penalty wasn't serious enough, or you feel it didn't account some things that you said. Maybe the finding was not guilty. Maybe the Discipline Committee determined, or the AIO determined, that the evidence wasn't there, and you're given an answer that you don't like and disagree with. You don't have the right to appeal, but as a member of the Academy, you have a right to share your views, have those raised. If you have issues about the process, you have an opportunity to have those raised. You can bring those to your dean. You can bring those to the AIO directly. You can bring them to me. We have ongoing conversations about these things all the time, and we try our best not to have those concerns fall on deaf ears, keeping in mind that, again, the stakes in these cases are for the student involved. The student is the one who lives with the outcome and has to move forward with it. And they're the ones that we kind of keep in mind. The discipline service is sort of designed for. The process is there for you to make use of. One of the costs of not being responsible for the outcome is that you don't have full control over it. I'm open to thoughts from our other panelists about those points, but I think that's an important point to make and think about going forward if you do have those kinds of cases. Did our participants have any other comments that they want to make before I take a look at this one? Other questions, and we can try to follow up with people directly if they have any. Maybe I'll go to. Okay. Corey raises a specific issue here. He says, I had an issue in the past in science where I had students cheat on a quiz. I reported the incident. We went to an AIO meeting. There wasn't an option for students to check the charge. A hearing was automatic. I think I know what Corey's talking about here, and that would have been a fairly exceptional circumstance, but a hearing being automatic. At the hearing, one of the students didn't show up, but another student did. Turns out that one student handed in work for another student. We wouldn't have caught that if there wasn't a hearing. Now that students can just accept the charge, how can we catch these instances where students submit work for another student? One of the things that we've been working on for the last couple of years, Corey, and I think this speaks directly to your question, it is not the case where accepting charges are automatic. That is not a change to the rules that have been made. We have been experimenting over the last couple of years with dealing with situations where a course has 30 students who are suspected of doing something, or 40 students are suspected of doing something fairly small, such as collaborating on a quiz or sharing answers or something like that. And we've been trying to figure out how we can come up with a process for dealing with that large of a number all at once in a fair and just way. And one of the attempts that have been made is to try to give students a little bit more of a swift opportunity to say, yes, you're right, I did this, I would like to move on with it. And there's some things that are lost in doing it that way. I don't believe that's a way that we're going to be using going forward, that we are still going to be leaning very heavily towards in-person meetings, if not one-on-one, then maybe with groups, to say, here is what we believed happened and here's how we think it should be resolved. But by and large, I would say we're still quite committed to having sit-down educational conversations with students that, yes, sometimes might reveal details about the case that we would not catch if we didn't meet with them. Those are important, and I think that our process will, by and large, retain that. I'm happy to throw to our other panelists here with any other comments that they have in the few minutes. Go ahead.
Oh.
And then Robin.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. I just like to say that in the Faculty of Computer Science, especially, other than I think 1 or 2 odd cases where we had a large number of student groups involved in something, we always have to listen to the students' point of view as well. So they get to give their point of view on what happens. And we do not give a recommendation without hearing their side. In these days, when we cannot have a face-to-face meeting, we do it over Skype, or we do give students an option of sending us their version to an email, and we have email exchanges or written submission. So we have to hear their side, and then based on the evidence and based on the meeting, we give a recommendation, and still the student can accept or reject it.
That's great. Thanks, Khurram. Robin, you.
What and who is to blame for what particular things, or how a particular event came about. And one of the things that I'm less concerned about is not about those details of process or things, but more about what the student is taking away from this process. And if we know that something went wrong, that the student that it seems like there's an offense was occurred, and that the student maybe doesn't have a good understanding of academic integrity, I'm much more concerned about getting to the root of that than about the necessarily what website they went to or whether there was an intermediary in exactly what happened. And so I just sometimes we get caught up in those details, and I think I try to keep in mind more the essence of what happened with a student.
That's helpful, Robin. Thanks. Justin, did you have a point to make?
Yeah, as a last point, Bob, I really want to stress that for all faculty that what we have to realize is this is not punitive. This is educational, and we really want to keep that in mind. That what we're trying to do is we're trying to help the students. So to follow up on Robin's point there, I think that's it's absolutely essential for faculty to remember that's what our goal is at the end of the day.
That's helpful, Justin. Thanks. In the document, a number of different concerns or issues that they have within the context of their course. Take a look at the other webinars that are being offered the rest of the week. There are going to be sessions about tools that are available for you that we have, things to think about as we move to wider online, full online delivery of our programs. And some of those things fora will be better suited for maybe some of the very, very specific questions that you might have about different things. Certainly be tuning into them. That's all I have. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank Center for Learning and Teaching for supporting this webinar. There's a question there about the slides. I don't have an issue with the slides being made available, and I believe that they can. Also, I'm available and easy to find if anybody has follow-up questions. I see a couple of things there. Please feel free to contact me directly, and I will do my best to answer them. That's all I have, unless there are any other comments. So that's, I think, about the size of it on my end.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to stop the recording now, but there is a quick question from Julie about plagiarism software affecting the AIO decision. Would you like to just quickly respond to that? Can you quickly respond to that?
I think I can. Yeah, no, I think I can very quickly. The plagiarism software really, all it does is reveal something, right? So whether you detect plagiarism on plagiarism software, whether you detect it with a Google search, whether you detect it with your own academic professional intuition and then track it down elsewhere, the question at the end of the day is going to be, is it plagiarism? Plagiarism software doesn't tell us if something is plagiarism. It just says there's something in here that sounds a lot like or exactly like something that we found somewhere else. That's really all the software does. After that, there has to be a conversation and an inquiry into where did it come from, how, and the student is invited to share their views and to say what it is. In fact, sometimes we have plagiarism software that picks up on things that are within the document itself, like bibliographies and properly cited materials and things like that. So we have to kind of sift through it and be very careful about what it is that we're flagging. So I would say that the software itself is a useful tool for detection, but its use doesn't necessarily, its presence as a tool that was used doesn't necessarily impact the AIO's decision. The amount of plagiarism, the seriousness of it, the egregiousness of it, the attempt to which the student was trying to hide someone else's work and pass it off as their own, that is what influences the AIO's decision. But Justin, Khurram, if you have other thoughts on that, or Susan or Robin at the SDC level, we've seen lots of plagiarism software reports too, and I'm happy to open it up if I missed anything. That's my sense of it.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm going to stop